Welcome to Soft-Spoken Mysteries. Tonight we're stepping into a world of thunder and terror, a world where wings didn't mean angels, but death on horseback. Imagine standing on a battlefield in the early morning mist. The year is 1610. You're a Russian soldier, and you've just been told your army outnumbers the enemy 5-1. 30,000 of you against maybe 6,000 of them. Victory seems certain. Then you hear it, a sound like distant thunder. But it's not thunder, it's hooves, thousands of them. And then something else, a rustling, a whistling, like the wind through a forest, but wrong, unnatural. The mist parts, and you see them, riders in gleaming armour. But behind each rider, rising from their backs like the wings of enormous birds, are frames of wood covered in eagle feathers. Each wing stands taller than a man. As the horses charge, the wings catch the air. The feathers rustle and whistle. The sound builds, louder, louder. It sounds like death itself is flying towards you. You have seconds to decide. Stand and face these winged demons, or run. Most men chose to run. Tonight, we're exploring the true story of the Polish Winged Hussars. Not the romanticized version, not the legend, the reality. And the reality is somehow even more terrifying than the myths. These weren't just elite cavalry, they were a military innovation, so effective, so psychologically devastating, that for 200 years they remained virtually undefeated in battle. They charged into impossible odds and won. They faced armies 10 times their size and scattered them like leaves, and they did it all wearing wings that made them look like angels of death. Let's begin with how something this extraordinary even came to exist. The story starts not in Poland, but in the Balkans. In the late 15th century, groups of Serbian warriors found themselves without a homeland. The Ottoman Empire had crushed the Serbian kingdoms. These warriors, skilled horsemen who had fought the Turks for years, became mercenaries. They called themselves Hussars, bandits, raiders. They were light cavalry, fast, mobile, deadly in hit-and-run attacks. They fought with curved sabres and short bows from horseback. Their tactics came from centuries of fighting in the mountainous Balkans, where speed mattered more than armour. In 1503, the Polish Parliament recognised the value of these exiled warriors. They officially formed the first Hussar units under 3 banners. At first, these Hussars were still light cavalry. They wore minimal armour. They relied on speed and surprise. But Poland had a problem. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth faced enemies on every border. To the east, Muscovy, what would become Russia. To the south, the Ottoman Empire and their Tatar vassals. To the north, Sweden. To the west, the Holy Roman Empire. Light cavalry alone wouldn't be enough. In 1576, King Stephen Báthory ascended to the throne. Báthory was a military genius. He looked at the Hussar units and saw potential for something revolutionary. He transformed them from light raiders into heavy shock cavalry, but he kept their speed, their mobility, their training. The result was something that had never existed before. Heavy cavalry as mobile as light cavalry. Warriors who could charge with the devastating impact of medieval knights, but who could also pursue, wheel, reform, and charge again with the agility of steppe horsemen. Báthory also added something else, something that would become the defining feature of these warriors. The wings. The exact origin of the wings is debated by historians. What we know for certain is that by the 1580s, Polish Hussars were attaching large wooden frames covered in eagle feathers to their backs or saddles. These wings could stand 6 feet tall. Some accounts describe them as mounted on the saddle, others on the armour itself. Contemporary paintings show both methods. The practical purpose was psychological warfare. When a hussar charged, the wind caught those wings, the feathers rustled. At a full gallop, hundreds of wings created a sound unlike anything else on a battlefield. Witnesses described it as a roaring whistle, a sound that grew louder and more terrifying as the charge approached. Some theories suggest the wings also served to protect against lassos used by Tatar cavalry. The frames made it nearly impossible to rope a hussar from his horse. Others suggest they made the rider appear larger, more intimidating, but the primary function was terror, and it worked. Let's talk about what it took to become a hussar, because this wasn't just about being a good horseman or brave in battle. This was about being born into the right social class and having enormous wealth. Hussars were recruited exclusively from the Polish nobility, the szlachta, and not just any nobility. You needed to be wealthy enough to afford the equipment, the horses, and the retainers that came with hussar service. A single hussar didn't ride alone. He commanded a small unit. The Towarzysz Husarski, the hussar companion, was the elite warrior himself, but he brought with him several retainers, squires, grooms, additional fighters. A full hussar lance might include the Towarzysz and 3 to 5 other men. All of this came at the Towarzysz's expense. The armour alone cost a fortune, beyond what most people today can easily comprehend. We're talking about a full suit of articulated plate armour that had to be custom fitted to each individual hussar's body. This wasn't mass-produced equipment. Each suit was essentially handcrafted by master armourers over weeks or months. Start with the cuirass. This was the breastplate and backplate covering the torso, made from specially treated steel that was hammered, shaped, heat-treated, and hammered again until it achieved the perfect balance of strength and flexibility. The front plate was thicker than the back, because most threats came from the front, but both had to curve precisely to the hussar's body. Too loose and the armour shifted during combat, throwing off balance. Too tight and it restricted breathing and movement. The cuirass attached to spaulders, covering the shoulders. These were complicated pieces composed of multiple overlapping plates that allowed the arms to move freely while still protecting the shoulder joints. A hussar needed full range of motion to wield his lance, his sabre, his firearms. The spaulders had to protect without restricting. Beavers protected the throat and lower face. Gorgets guarded the neck. Arm bracers covered the forearms, each piece articulated with the others through leather straps and metal rivets. The entire suit moved with the body, almost like a second skin made of steel. But here's what made hussar armour different from Western knight armour. It was lighter. The Poles had developed special steel working techniques that produced metal that was both harder and more flexible than what most European armourers could achieve. Some historians attribute this to Polish armourers learning techniques from Eastern craftsmen, possibly through trade with the Ottomans, or exposure to Persian metalworking methods. The result was armour that might weigh 40 to 50 pounds total. That sounds heavy, and it was, but it was lighter than the full plate armour worn by German or French knights, which could exceed 70 pounds. And crucially, the weight was distributed across the entire body. A hussar wearing his armour could move, could run if necessary, could mount and dismount his horse without assistance. The helmet was typically a burgonet or a lobster-tailed pot helmet. The burgonet was an open-faced helmet with a peak to protect the eyes from sun glare and a neck guard that extended down to overlap with the gorget. The lobster tail was similar but with a segmented neck guard that looked like, well, a lobster's tail. Both designs provided excellent protection while allowing clear vision and unrestricted breathing. A hussar who couldn't see or hear properly was a dead hussar. All of this armour was often elaborately decorated, not just for vanity, though appearance mattered. The decorations announced status. Gold leaf applied to the steel, intricate etchings of religious scenes or family crests, ornamental rivets, inlaid patterns. A hussar's armour was a work of art as much as it was military equipment. And remember, this was only part of what he wore. Over the armour went a contus, a long flowing robe. These were made of expensive fabrics, silk, velvet, brocade, usually in Poland's colours of red and white, but sometimes other colours, depending on which banner the Hussar served under. The kontus served several purposes. It identified the Hussar as nobility. It provided an additional layer that could potentially snag sword blows or arrows. And in cold weather, it trapped body heat, keeping the Hussar warm inside his metal shell. Over one shoulder, always the exotic pelt. Leopard skin was common, draped over the left shoulder and fastened across the chest. Tiger, if you could get one. Lion, jaguar. These weren't native to Poland, obviously. They were imported at great expense, or taken as spoils from Ottoman enemies who had gotten them through their own trade networks. The pelts served as status symbols. They announced that this was a wealthy warrior, a successful warrior, someone who had either the money to buy such things or the prowess to take them in battle. For veterans and commanding officers, the pelts were different. Wolf, brown bear, lynx. These northern animals were harder to hunt than people might think. A full-grown brown bear is a terrifying opponent, even for armed men. Wearing its pelt announced that you were a survivor, a leader, someone who had proven themselves through years of service. And then the wings. The wings remain the most distinctive and the most debated feature of the Hussar uniform. The frames were constructed from wood, usually fir or pine, bent and shaped into large arcs that stood between 5 and 7 feet tall. Eagle feathers were the preferred material for covering these frames. Eagle feathers have a particular quality when they catch the wind. They don't just flap, they whistle. They create this eerie rushing sound that carries across distances. Some hussars used falcon feathers, some used goose feathers, which were cheaper but still effective. The feathers were attached to the wooden frame in overlapping rows like roof tiles or fish scales. This arrangement meant that when air moved through them during a charge, each individual feather contributed to the overall sound effect. The attachment method varied. Some hussars bolted the wing frames directly to the backplate of their armour. Others mounted them on the saddle behind where they sat. Contemporary paintings show both methods, sometimes even in the same unit, which suggests that individual preference played a role. Mounting on the armour meant the wings moved with the rider, creating more noise and visual effect. Mounting on the saddle was more stable, easier to manage, but less dramatically visual. Either way, when hundreds of these winged hussars charged together, the sound was unlike anything else on a battlefield. Witnesses compared it to a roaring wind, to the rush of a massive waterfall, to the sound of angels' wings, to demons shrieking. The psychological impact on enemies who had never seen or heard anything like it cannot be overstated. Now imagine you're an infantryman, 17th century. You've been trained to stand in formation, hold your pike, fire your musket when ordered. You know cavalry is dangerous, but you've been told that pike squares and discipline can stop cavalry charges. Then you hear this sound building in the distance. You turn and see hundreds of armoured riders, and they have wings, massive wings rising behind them. The sound grows louder as they approach. The earth shakes from the hoofbeats. Your officers are shouting to hold formation, but your instincts are screaming at you to run, because what you're seeing doesn't make sense. Men don't have wings. Men shouldn't sound like that. Many formations broke before the hussars even reached them. Just broke. Men threw down their pikes and ran. And once a formation broke, once soldiers turned their backs to run, they were easy targets for charging cavalry. That's when the real killing began. The wings served their purpose before a single lance drew blood. And the weapons. The primary weapon was the lance, but not like any lance you might imagine from medieval tournaments. The Hussar lance was a masterpiece of engineering. It was called a copia, hollow, made from fir wood, between 16 and 20 feet long. That's longer than the lances used by Western knights, but despite its length, it was lighter. The hollow construction made it strong but manageable at full gallop. At the tip, a steel point, often with a cross guard to prevent the lance from penetrating too deeply into an enemy. This was crucial. A lance that went too deep could get stuck. In the chaos of a charge, you needed to be able to withdraw your weapon and use it again. Behind the tip, a small pennant. These pennants served multiple purposes. They showed which banner the hussar belonged to, and they made the lance more visible in the chaos of battle. A trained hussar could couch this massive lance, charge at full speed, impact an enemy, and either kill them outright or knock them from their horse with such force that the enemy's armour crumpled. But the lance was just the beginning. Every hussar carried a sabre, a Polish sabre, curved, single-edged, designed for cutting from horseback. The curve gave the blade devastating cutting power. In the hands of a trained hussar, a single cut could sever a limb. They also carried a konkurz, a long thrusting sword. This was for penetrating armour, straight, narrow blade, designed to punch through the gaps in enemy plate armour or chainmail, effective against heavily armoured opponents who couldn't be cut down with a sabre. 2 pistols. By the late 16th century, wheel-locks, later flintlocks. Hussars were trained to fire from horseback, though this was challenging at full gallop. More often, they used pistols in close combat after the initial charge broke enemy lines. Some also carried a warhammer, a mace, an axe, whatever their personal preference and wealth allowed. And the horses. The horses were as important as the men riding them, perhaps more so. Polish hussar horses were a carefully bred mix. The base stock came from sturdy European breeds, horses bred for carrying armoured knights, but these were crossed with Arabian horses, either captured from the Ottomans or received as tribute. The result was a horse that combined strength, size, and endurance with speed and agility. These horses stood about 16 hands, large but not the massive destriers of Western Europe. They needed to carry an armoured man plus the weight of equipment, but they also needed to gallop for extended periods and manoeuvre quickly. Training a hussar horse took years. From the time they were foals, these horses were exposed to the sounds of battle. Drums, trumpets, gunfire, shouting. They were trained not to panic. They were trained in the precise movements required for the hussar charge, to maintain formation, to accelerate smoothly from a walk to a gallop, to wheel and turn in tight spaces. The horses were so valuable that selling them outside the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was punishable by death. The penalty was called the throat, execution, because these horses were strategic assets. Lose the horses, lose the hussars, and losing the hussars could mean losing Poland. Now let's talk about how they fought, because the hussar charge wasn't just riding at the enemy and hoping for the best. It was a precisely choreographed tactical maneuver that required years of training to execute properly. Training for a hussar was intensive, rigorous, unforgiving. One documented training exercise involved galloping at full speed, then turning your horse in a complete circle within a space no more than 2 meters in diameter, without falling out of the circle, then galloping again and repeating the maneuver. Think about what that requires. Perfect balance, complete control of your horse, the strength to guide a 16-hand horse through a violent turn without losing your seat, all while wearing armour and carrying a lance. This level of horsemanship made hussars capable of tactical flexibility that other cavalry couldn't match. The basic formation for a hussar charge was wedge-shaped, like an arrowhead. This was called the kleshcha formation. Pincers. The wedge concentrated force at a specific point. Instead of a straight line of cavalry hitting an enemy formation evenly, the wedge drove into one point like a spear. It created a breakthrough. Once the wedge penetrated enemy lines, the following hussars poured through the gap. Here's how a typical charge worked. The hussars would form up at a distance from the enemy, 1,000 yards or more. They would begin at a walk, slow, deliberate. The formation staggered but maintaining the overall wedge shape. This was crucial. Starting too close together invited enemy fire. Starting too far apart lost the impact of the charge. The staggered formation meant that if enemy cannon or musket fire took down one rider, it didn't cause a chain reaction of horses colliding. At 500 yards, the pace increased to a trot. The formation began to tighten. The wings caught the air. The rustling started. At 200 yards, the gallop. Now the formation closed in, shoulder to shoulder, no more than a horse's width between each rider. The lances came down, couched under the arm, points forward. The wings roared. The sound must have been overwhelming. Hundreds of horses thundering forward, the rustling shriek of thousands of feathers, the clash of armour, war cries, drumming, trumpets, and the sight. Hundreds of riders in gleaming armour, massive wings rising behind them, lances like a forest of spears, all bearing down at 30 miles per hour. Most infantry formations broke before the Hussars even made contact. But if they held, the impact was catastrophic. A Hussar lance, couched properly, hit with the combined force of horse and rider. At full gallop, that's over a ton of force, concentrated on a single point. Contemporary accounts describe a single lance impaling multiple men, 5 at once in some reports. Whether that's literally true is debatable. What's certain is that the impact of hundreds of lances hitting simultaneously shattered formations. Men were thrown backward, armour crumpled. The front ranks of an infantry formation would simply cease to exist, and then the Hussars were through, behind enemy lines. This is where training mattered. Most cavalry, after charging through an enemy formation, would scatter. Pursue individual enemies, lose cohesion. Not the Hussars. They would wheel, reform, and charge again, sometimes 8 or 10 times in a single battle. This was why the training was so rigorous, why the horses were so carefully bred and trained. Because a single charge might break an enemy, but if it didn't, you needed to be able to do it again and again, until the enemy shattered completely. Let's look at some specific battles, because the Hussars didn't just look impressive, they won. Against overwhelming odds repeatedly. September 8th, 1514, the Battle of Orsha, one of the largest battles of the 16th century. 30,000 Polish-Lithuanian forces under Hetman Konstantin Ostrogski faced 80,000 Russians under Ivan Cheladin. The Polish forces, with Hussar banners leading the cavalry, broke the Russian centre. The Russian army, despite outnumbering the Poles nearly 3-1, was routed. Russian casualties exceeded 30,000, Polish losses numbered in the hundreds. September 27th, 1605. The Battle of Kircholm, near the Lithuanian border. Charles IX of Sweden invaded with an army of approximately 14,000 men, Swedish infantry, equipped with the latest pike and shot tactics. Swedish cavalry, artillery. The Polish-Lithuanian force numbered around 4,000. Roughly 2,500 of them were Hussars. The Swedes formed up in the standard formation of the day. Pike squares, musketeers, cavalry on the wings. They expected a long battle of manoeuvre and firepower. The Polish commander, Jan Karol Chodkiewicz, studied the Swedish formation. He sent his Hussars in 3 waves, not all at once, in controlled, devastating charges. The first wave hit the Swedish cavalry on the left wing, scattered them, pursued them off the battlefield. The second wave hit the pike squares from the side. Pike squares are effective against frontal charges. They're vulnerable when hit from an angle. The Hussars shattered 2 squares. The third wave finished the work. The Swedish army disintegrated. 9,000 Swedes died. The Polish-Lithuanian forces lost fewer than 100 men. The Swedish king himself barely escaped with his life. Before we get to their tactical masterpiece at Klushino, we need to talk about the Battle of Vienna, September 12, 1683, because this was the Hussars' moment of greatest glory, the battle that cemented their legend across all of Europe. The Ottoman Empire, under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, had laid siege to Vienna with a massive army. Estimates vary wildly depending on the source, but most contemporary historians agree on approximately 150,000 Ottoman troops surrounding the city. Some accounts push that number higher, to 170,000 or even more. Vienna's defenders numbered about 15,000 soldiers plus armed citizens. They'd held out for 2 months of brutal siege warfare, but they were exhausted, starving. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. The city walls had been undermined by Ottoman sappers digging tunnels beneath them. Explosives had been placed in the tunnels, ready to blow massive gaps in Vienna's defences. The city was days, maybe hours from falling. If Vienna fell, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The Ottomans would have had an open road into the heart of Western Europe. The Holy Roman Empire would have been vulnerable to invasion. The balance of power across the entire continent would have shifted dramatically in favour of the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't just about one city, this was about the future of Europe itself. King Jan III Sobieski of Poland arrived with a relief army after force-marching his troops for days. He brought approximately 20,000 men, among them 3,000 winged hussars. These weren't rookie soldiers, these were veterans. Many had fought the Ottomans in previous campaigns. They knew Ottoman tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses, how they deployed janissaries, how their cavalry fought, what broke their formations. Sobieski positioned his army on the Kahlenberg Heights, the hills overlooking Vienna from the northwest. From this elevated position, he could survey the entire battlefield spread out below, the massive Ottoman siege camp surrounding the city. Like a noose, the siege trenches zigzagging toward the walls, the desperate defenders on the ramparts, waving frantically at their rescuers. The terrain was challenging for cavalry. Heavily forested slopes, uneven ground full of ravines and rocky outcrops, vineyards with their organised rows of vines creating obstacles. Not ideal for the kind of massive coordinated charge that was the Hussars' specialty. But Sobieski, who was himself an experienced Hussar commander, saw an opportunity. The Ottoman forces were completely focused on Vienna. They had their backs to the Kahlenberg Heights. They weren't expecting a major attack from that direction. Their entire siege apparatus, their supply lines, their command structure, everything was oriented toward the city walls. And critically, their forces were dispersed. Besieging a city requires surrounding it, which meant the Ottoman army was spread thin around Vienna's entire perimeter. They weren't concentrated. They weren't prepared for a major cavalry assault from the hills. Sobieski spent the morning of September 12th positioning his forces with meticulous care. Infantry moved down the lower slopes. Artillery positioned on the heights where they could fire over the infantry's heads. And the cavalry, including all 3,000 hussars, were hidden in the forests on the flanks, waiting for the signal to charge. The battle began around 4 in the afternoon with an infantry advance, Polish and German and Austrian foot soldiers pushing down the slopes toward the Ottoman siege lines. Musket fire crackled, cannon boomed, men shouted war cries in a dozen languages. The Ottomans responded aggressively. Thousands of janissaries, the Ottoman Sultan's elite infantry units, moved to counter the attack. Ottoman cavalry manoeuvred to flank the advancing infantry. This was exactly what Sobieski wanted. The Ottoman forces were now fully engaged, committed to the fight, their attention focused entirely on the infantry battle developing before them. And then Sobieski unleashed the cavalry. From the forests on both flanks, 18,000 horsemen emerged into the late afternoon sunlight. Polish hussars, German cuirassiers, Austrian cavalry, all of them thundering down the slopes toward the Ottoman positions in a massive coordinated charge. The hussars led the attack on the right wing, 3,000 of them. Their wings caught the wind as they accelerated, the rustling roar building and building, audible even over the gunfire and shouting. Lances came down, levelled forward, a moving wall of armoured men and horses, accelerating downhill, bearing down on the Ottoman positions with unstoppable momentum. The Ottoman cavalry, veteran Sipahi horsemen, tried to mount a countercharge. They were brave men, experienced warriors, but they were on relatively flat ground at the base of the hills, trying to receive a charge that was coming from elevated terrain. The physics simply weren't in their favour. The Polish Hussars had gravity on their side, adding even more momentum to their already devastating charge. When they collided, the force was overwhelming. The impact shattered the Ottoman cavalry formations. Horses went down, men were impaled on lances or trampled under iron-shod hooves. Those who survived the initial impact scattered in every direction, the cohesion of their units completely destroyed. And then the Hussars were through, punching deep into the rear, areas of the Ottoman siege lines. Absolute chaos erupted throughout the Ottoman camp. The Janissaries, who moments before had been advancing confidently against the Christian infantry to their front, suddenly found themselves with cavalry behind them. They were caught between two forces, trapped. They tried to retreat, to regroup, but there was nowhere to go. The advancing infantry pressed from one direction, the rampaging cavalry from another. The entire Ottoman siege line collapsed in a matter of hours, and the cavalry kept charging. They didn't stop at breaking the first line. They drove deep into the Ottoman camp. Sobieski himself rode at the head of the Hussars. The King of Poland, 64 years old, white-haired and battle-scarred, leading personally from the very front in one of the largest cavalry charges in recorded history. Contemporary estimates put the total cavalry force involved at somewhere around 20,000 horsemen, 20,000 men on horseback, charging together across several miles of battlefield in one massive coordinated attack. It was, quite possibly, the largest unified cavalry charge ever recorded up to that point in human history. The thunder of 80,000 hooves, the rustling scream of 3,000 sets of hussar wings, the war cries of men from Poland and Germany and Austria and a dozen other nations, all charging together. The Ottoman Grand Vizier's tent was overrun. Kara Mustafa fled for his life, leaving behind his treasury, his correspondence, his personal effects. The Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, commander of 150,000 men, running for his life from Polish cavalry. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were killed in the fighting. Thousands more were captured. The rest retreated in disorder back toward Hungary and eventually to Ottoman territory. The siege of Vienna was broken. Decisively, completely. The Ottoman threat to Central Europe was ended. Vienna was saved. Western Europe was saved. In the aftermath, King Sobieski sent a message to Pope Innocent V. The words echoed through European courts. Veni, vidi, Deus vitit. We came, we saw, God conquered. It was a deliberate play on Julius Caesar's famous Veni, vidi, vici, but Sobieski gave credit to divine providence rather than claiming the glory for himself. Humble words from a man who had just led one of the most important cavalry charges in European history. The Hussars returned to Poland as heroes celebrated across the entire continent. They were the saviours of Vienna, the warriors who had broken the Ottoman siege, the cavalry that had delivered one of the most crushing defeats the Ottoman Empire had ever suffered. Their reputation, already formidable, became legendary. But remarkable as Vienna was, it perhaps wasn't the Hussars' most impressive tactical achievement, because 11 years before Vienna there had been another battle, one that shows the Hussars at their absolute tactical best, where sheer skill and audacity overcame truly impossible odds. The Battle of Klushino, the Polish-Lithuanian forces under Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski were besieging Smolensk. A Russian relief army of 30,000 men under Prince Dmitry Świecki approached. Additionally, 5,000 Swedish mercenaries fighting for Russia, a combined force of 35,000. Żółkiewski had about 6,500 men. Roughly 5,500 of them were hussars. He left some forces to maintain the siege and took his mobile units to intercept the Russians. The force he led to battle numbered about 6,800 men. The Russians expected to overwhelm the Poles through sheer numbers. They formed up in standard defensive positions, infantry with pikes and muskets behind village fences, cavalry in reserve, artillery in the camp. Żółkiewski attacked at dawn, before the Russians were fully prepared. The first Hussar charge hit the Russian left wing. The Russian cavalry retreated. The Hussars wheeled and struck the infantry from the side. The wooden fences that were supposed to protect the Russian infantry became obstacles that prevented them from retreating. The Hussars charged 8 times, each charge breaking another part of the Russian formation. The battle lasted about 5 hours. Russian losses approached 5,000 dead. Polish losses numbered around 400, including 100 Hussars. The Swedish mercenaries, seeing the battle was hopeless, negotiated surrender. Following the victory, Żółkiewski marched on Moscow. Within weeks he entered the Russian capital. The Russian Tsar, Vasily IV, was deposed. The Polish Prince Władysław was briefly proclaimed Tsar of Russia. This is the only time in history that a foreign power successfully captured and held Moscow, until Napoleon, 2 centuries later. And Napoleon's occupation lasted weeks. The Poles held Moscow for 2 years. The Hussar charge at Klushino opened the gates to the Russian capital. But perhaps the most astonishing victory came much later, as the age of the Hussars was ending. June 11th, 1694. The Battle of Hodów. A Crimean Tatar raiding force invaded Polish territory. Their goal was to capture slaves and loot the countryside. Tatar raids were a constant threat to Poland's southern borders. Fast-moving cavalry raiders who struck quickly and disappeared before Polish forces could respond. This raid was larger than usual. 40,000 Tatars, possibly more. Some estimates go as high as 70,000. Polish forces in the area numbered 400 men, 100 Hussars, 300 pancerni, lighter armoured cavalry, 400 against 40,000. The initial encounter happened on open ground near the village of Hodów. The Polish cavalry charged the Tatar vanguard. 700 Tatars. The charge drove them back, but then the main Tatar force appeared. 40,000 riders cresting the hills. The Polish commander, Mikołaj Tyszkowski, made a decision. They couldn't outrun the Tatars. Tatar horses were bred for speed and endurance. Trying to escape would mean being run down and killed piecemeal. So they retreated to Hodów village. And they fortified. They used everything available. Wooden fences left from previous Tatar raids, wagons, barrels, tables, doors. They created makeshift barricades. The buildings of the village became strong points. The Hussars dismounted. Yes, dismounted. Heavy cavalry fighting on foot behind improvised fortifications. The Tatars attacked in waves. Thousands of light cavalry charging fortified positions. It should have been a slaughter. The Tatars vastly outnumbered the Poles. They had mobility. They could surround the village completely. But the Polish position negated the Tatar advantages. The Tatars had to attack on foot or ride into killing zones. Their bows, which had high rates of fire, couldn't penetrate Hussar armour at range. The Polish firearms, wheel-lock muskets, pistols, carbines, were more effective at close range. The battle lasted 6 hours. Wave after wave of Tatar warriors attacked. Wave after wave was driven back. The Poles fired until they ran out of bullets. Then they used Tatar arrows as improvised ammunition for their guns. After the battle, the Poles collected several carts full of arrows. Thousands of arrows fired at them during the fight, evidence of the intensity of the attacks they'd endured. The Tatars lost somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 men. The Polish casualties numbered fewer than 100. Most were wounded, very few killed. Finally, the Tatars sent a Polish-speaking translator under a white flag. They offered terms. Surrender now, and you'll be treated as prisoners of war. We'll ransom you back to Poland, Refuse and we'll kill every one of you. The Polish response was simple. We'd rather die. The Tatars withdrew, not because they couldn't have eventually overwhelmed the Polish position. They almost certainly could have. But the cost would have been enormous. Thousands more dead. And for what? 400 prisoners who were proving more trouble than they were worth. The Tatars left Poland. The raid was a failure. King Jan Sobieski, the same king who had led the Hussars at the Battle of Vienna 11 years earlier, heard about the defence of Hodów. He rewarded every survivor. Money, replacement horses, medical care. He ordered a monument built on the site. The battle became known as the Polish Thermopylae, except unlike the Spartans at Thermopylae, the Poles won. 400 against 40,000, and the 400 survived. Let's talk about what daily life was like for a Hussar, because being an elite warrior wasn't just about the battles, it was a complete lifestyle, a commitment that shaped every aspect of existence. First, the economics. A Hussar towarzysz wasn't paid a salary in the modern sense. He received land grants, income from estates. The Polish monarchy provided some equipment, specifically the lances, which were expensive to produce and maintain. But everything else came out of the towarzysz's pocket. The armour alone could cost the equivalent of several years' income for a common soldier. A single suit of properly fitted Hussar armour might cost as much as a small farm. An armour needed constant maintenance, repairs from battle damage, replacement of broken pieces, cleaning and oiling to prevent rust. The horses required even more investment. Breeding programs, training from foalhood, specialised feed. A destrier Arabian cross wasn't cheap, and you needed spares. Horses were injured in battle. They got sick, went lame. A Hussar might own 3 or 4 horses to ensure he always had a battle-ready mount. Then the retainers. Every towarzysz commanded a lance, 3 to 5 additional men. These men needed to be equipped, fed, housed. They received a share of any plunder taken in campaigns, but their basic needs came from the towarzysz's resources. So being a Hussar meant being wealthy, very wealthy. Only the upper nobility could afford it, but wealth brought status. A Hussar was at the pinnacle of Polish military and social hierarchy. Hussars sat at the right hand of kings. They advised on military strategy. Their opinions carried weight in the parliament. Training was constant. Even in times of peace, Hussars drilled. They practiced charges on training grounds. They competed in tournaments. They honed their skills with the lance, the sabre, the pistol. Physical conditioning was crucial. Riding for hours in full armour required strength and endurance. Hussars trained with weights. They practiced sword forms. They ran, swam, hunted. Hunting served multiple purposes. It provided meat for the household. It kept horses and riders sharp. And it maintained the warrior mindset. A man who could ride down a boar or a deer could ride down an enemy. The lifestyle was militaristic even in peacetime. Wake before dawn, morning prayers, physical training, weapon practice, horsemanship drills, tactical studies, more prayers, evening meals with fellow Hussars, discussing military matters, planning for campaigns, analysing past battles. And when campaigns came, Hussars were expected to respond immediately. The Polish military system relied on mobilization. When war threatened, the king issued a summons. Hussars were required to appear with their lances ready, full equipment, provisions for themselves and their retainers, horses in battle-ready condition. Failure to respond could result in loss of estates, loss of noble status, disgrace. The campaigns themselves were grueling. Hussars might ride hundreds of miles to reach a battlefield. They fought in all weather, summer heat, winter cold, rain, snow, mud. Battle was terrifying even for trained warriors. The noise, the chaos, the violence. Men screamed, horses screamed, the clash of metal on metal. Gunfire, explosions, blood, death. But Hussars were trained to function in chaos, to maintain formation, even when men around them were falling, to follow orders, even when terror screamed at them to run. After battle came the aftermath, caring for wounded, burying the dead, collecting equipment from fallen enemies, securing prisoners for ransom, treating injured horses, and then preparing for the next battle. Because wars in this era often involved multiple engagements, over months or years. Between campaigns there was always more training, more preparation, because a hussar who let his skills atrophy wouldn't survive the next battle. The lifestyle took a toll. Many hussars died young. Battle wounds, injuries from training accidents, disease, because armies travelling through unfamiliar territory encountered plagues and epidemics. Those who survived to middle age often bore the marks of their service, scars, missing fingers or hands from sabre cuts, broken bones that healed poorly, hearing loss from gunfire, the mental weight of having killed and seen friends killed. But they also bore honours, grants of additional land from the king, titles, respect, the knowledge that they were the elite, the best cavalry in Europe, possibly the best cavalry in the world, and for 2 centuries that claim was justified by victory after victory, but nothing lasts forever. By the late 17th century, military technology was changing. Firearms were becoming more accurate, more powerful, more common. Infantry equipped with muskets and organised in disciplined formations could deliver devastating volleys of fire. The hussar charge, which had been unstoppable against pike formations and earlier firearms, became increasingly costly against massed musket fire. A volley from 100 muskets at close range could bring down dozens of horses, break a charge before it reached enemy lines. At the Battle of Klushino in 1702, Swedish infantry, armed with improved muskets, decimated attacking hussar formations. The Poles won the battle through superior numbers and tactics, but the hussars suffered heavy casualties. The writing was on the wall. Heavy cavalry was becoming obsolete. The Polish military began transitioning toward lighter cavalry, uhlans, dragoons, mounted infantry who could fight on foot as effectively as on horseback. By 1776, the hussars were officially disbanded. Their duties and traditions were passed to uhlan regiments. Some hussar units continued in ceremonial roles for a few more years, but they were no longer combat formations. The age of the winged hussars had ended, but their legacy continued. The hussars represented something unique in military history. They were heavy cavalry who fought like light cavalry. They combined the shock impact of armoured knights with the mobility and tactical flexibility of steppe horsemen. For 200 years that combination made them nearly invincible. Their tactics influenced cavalry doctrine across Europe. The idea of disciplined, coordinated charges, the use of multiple waves, the importance of being able to reform and charge again. These concepts became standard in European cavalry training. The psychological impact of their appearance, the wings, the exotic armour, the lances, demonstrated the importance of morale in warfare. An enemy who breaks before you reach them doesn't need to be defeated. They're already beaten, and the sheer improbability of their victories became legendary. 6,000 against 35,000 at Klushino, 400 against 40,000 at Hodów. These weren't just military victories, they were testament to the power of training, discipline, and superior tactics over raw numbers. The hussars proved that a smaller, better trained, better equipped force could defeat a much larger enemy if they fought smart. This lesson echoed through military thinking for centuries. Even today, the Polish military honours the hussar legacy. The 11th Armoured Cavalry Division uses the hussar wing as its symbol. Hussar armour is displayed in museums across Poland. Warsaw, Krakow, preserved as national treasures. Reenactors dress in hussar armour. They practice the charges. They keep the traditions alive. Because the hussars aren't just military history, they're a symbol of Polish national identity, of resilience, of the ability to face impossible odds and triumph through skill and courage, and the stories continue to inspire. In 2004, an amateur archaeologist in Poland found Hussar armour with his metal detector. The armour had been buried for centuries. When it was excavated and restored, it revealed incredible craftsmanship, articulated plates that moved with the body, decorative etchings that had survived hundreds of years underground, a tangible connection to that legendary past. The armour was added to museum collections. Another piece of evidence that these warriors really existed, that the stories, as incredible as they seem, are true. There's also speculation about cultural influences. Some historians believe J.R.R. Tolkien drew inspiration from the Hussars when writing about the Rohirrim in The Lord of the Rings. The scene where King Theoden leads his cavalry down from the hills to break the siege of Minas Tirith mirrors the charge of the Hussars at Vienna. A king leading his cavalry in a desperate charge against overwhelming odds. The largest cavalry charge in history in both the fiction and the reality. Whether Tolkien explicitly drew from this source is debated, but the parallels are striking. And that's fitting, because the Hussars had something mythic about them even in their own time. Warriors who wore wings and rode to battle like angels of death, who charged into impossible odds and won, who turned the tide of history through courage and skill. They weren't invincible. They lost battles, they took casualties, individual Hussars, died in combat like any other soldiers. But as a formation, as a tactical concept, they were as close to invincible as any military unit has ever been. From 1576, when King Stephen Báthory reformed them into heavy cavalry, until the Battle of Klushino in 1702, the Hussars fought in dozens of major battles. They won virtually all of them. Think about that. Over a century of continuous military success, generations of Hussars riding to war, winning, surviving, training the next generation to do the same. Very few military traditions can claim that level of sustained excellence. The Hussars could because they never stopped adapting. They added firearms when firearms became important. They modified their tactics as enemies changed. They maintained the core concept, disciplined heavy cavalry, capable of devastating charges. But they evolved the details as technology and warfare evolved. Until evolution wasn't enough. Until the fundamental nature of warfare shifted so much that heavy cavalry, no matter how skilled, couldn't survive on the modern battlefield. But while they lasted, they were magnificent. Imagine being a Polish peasant in 1694. You hear the Tatars are coming, 40,000 of them, raiders who burn villages and drag people away to be sold as slaves in distant markets. You're terrified. And then you hear that 400 Polish cavalrymen are standing in their way. 400 against 40,000. It sounds like suicide. You expect to hear they were slaughtered. Instead, you hear they won. The Tatars retreated. The village of Hodów still stands. The monument rises where your countrymen held the line. That's what the Hussars meant to Poland. They weren't just soldiers, they were protectors, symbols of national strength, proof that Poland could stand against any threat. And they did, for 200 years. Then the world changed. Firearms became too powerful. Infantry tactics became too effective. The cavalry charge, which had dominated battlefields for millennia, became obsolete. The last Hussars hung up their wings. They put away their lances. They watched as younger men in different uniforms took their place. But they knew. They had been part of something extraordinary, something that would be remembered. And they were right. Centuries later, people still talk about the Winged Hussars. Military historians still study their tactics. Museums still display their armour. Artists still paint scenes of their charges. Because some things are worth remembering. The courage to face impossible odds. The discipline to train until excellence becomes instinct. The willingness to stand when standing seems pointless. The determination to win when victory seems impossible. These qualities aren't obsolete. They don't depend on technology or tactics. They're human qualities, and the Hussars embodied them. That's why their story matters, not just because they won battles, but because of how they won them, through preparation, through skill, through refusing to accept defeat. 400 men hold off 40,000. Not through luck, not through miracles, through discipline and courage and the belief that training and tactics could overcome any odds. They were right. The wings they wore became their symbol, but the wings weren't what made them dangerous. The wings were theatre, psychological warfare, a way to terrify enemies before the fighting even began. What made them dangerous was everything underneath those wings. The years of training, the carefully bred horses, the precision-crafted weapons, the tactical doctrine developed through decades of warfare, the willingness to charge into death and trust that your companions would do the same. That's what broke enemy armies. The wings just made sure everyone knew who was doing the breaking. Today, if you visit Poland, you can see Hussar armour in museums. You can visit the monument at Hodów, where 400 held against 40,000. You can stand on the battlefield at Klushino and imagine 6,000 Hussars shattering an army 5 times their size. You can attend reenactments where men in replica armour practice the charges, the formations, keeping the memory alive. Because some stories are too good to forget. Some achievements too remarkable to let fade into history. The Polish Winged Hussars were one of those stories, one of those achievements. They rode out of the mists of history, wearing wings and carrying lances. They charged into impossible battles and won. They defended their homeland against enemies who outnumbered them 10 to 1. And for 200 years, they remained undefeated, not because they were invincible, but because they were the best, the most skilled, the most disciplined, the most courageous. And when the age of cavalry ended, when firearms and modern warfare made their tactics obsolete, they didn't disappear into obscurity. They became legends. The warriors with wings, the cavalry that couldn't be stopped, the defenders who stood when standing seemed impossible. That's who they were. That's what they did. And that's why, centuries after the last Hussar hung up his wings, we still tell their stories. Because some things deserve to be remembered. Some courage deserves to be honoured. Some achievements deserve to echo through the ages. The Polish Winged Hussars earned that immortality. Battle by battle, charge by charge, victory by victory. They were the angels of death on horseback, and for 200 years they were unstoppable. This has been Soft Spoken Mysteries. Until next time.